This is the only name in business. Welcome to another edition of Business Redefined, where we are delving into matters taxation. The last week has been heavy on the matters public finance from the Finance Act. Then we had the tax revenue, or rather the revenue outturn published by KRA. And we want to delve into that with my guests, Christine Kahema from Alpha Tax Advisory and Robert Wareru, to whom I should apologize, by the way. The poster read KMPG. It should be KPMG Kenya. Apologies to the team from KPMG. I hear you have raised that issue. Sorry about that. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome on set. Let's kick off very straight into it. Christine, the revenue outturn published by KRA, I can't remember the last time I saw a surplus being reported. Quite impressive performance there. Yes. What were your initial thoughts on this?
Wow, that was very interesting to see the performance of 1.669 trillion in a very difficult COVID year. But let me tell you, Mboko, KRA worked very hard that last quarter, the first and second quarter of 2021, and also because you can imagine last year was very, very tight with COVID, with reduced tax rates and many other challenges that they faced. But come 2021, first quarter and second quarter, we have seen a tremendous increase because of the reversals that were of the tax rates, of the COVID incentives that had been previously given. Secondly, compliance levels have significantly increased. I mean, nowadays, because of the interlink between the systems, you just have to comply. There is no opportunity not to comply. So that has really assisted the Revenue Authority in driving those revenues. I mean, it's been quite a long time since we saw positive surpluses from a revenue collection perspective.
Let me hold you there, Christine, and cross over to Robert here. Robert, two things which stood out for me. One is the decoupling we saw between domestic excise and domestic VAT, where domestic excise was going up by about 12%, if I'm not wrong. Domestic VAT was down by 7.9%. Granted, there was the reduction in VAT from 16 to 14%. But how do you explain this decoupling between the two? Because typically being in direct taxes, they would ideally be moving in synchrony.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, Julian. Just before I get onto that, I think one other thing to commend Revenue Authority for is the tax-based expansion. If you looked at that outturn report, they talked about growing the taxpayers, registered taxpayers, to about 6.1 million taxpayers. That's almost double. That definitely tells you that Revenue Authority is doing a good job. Now, coming back to your question around the decoupling, it's an interesting phenomenon that we need to understand why, because both of them are consumption taxes. So you would expect that they would move in the same trend. However, I suspect that because VAT is on quite a number of things that excess duty does not apply to, possibly excess duty then registered a growth, whereas VAT, based on the stress of not consuming or not the ability to purchase, the purchasing power, I think that might have explained the reason why VAT did not perform as well as excess duty, in my view.
Christine, coming to you, as you rightly said, exemplary performance in a very tough year. Some have asked, if KRA and other agencies can deliver this performance in a COVID environment, have we been under-targeting from a revenue projection standpoint?
Interesting question. I don't think we've been under-targeting. I think the challenge has been how to increase that tax base. That has been the dilemma that has always been there. And now the pressure is real. I mean, when you look at our budget for the next financial year is about 3.6 trillion. And we are trying to collect about 1.776 trillion. You've got to think outside the box. Outside the box being increasing the tax base. So how do you do that? Mboko, they say about 60% of our GDPs is with SMEs, but SMEs are not significantly contributing to that tax base. So I think it's just about thinking about what else can we do as government in order to generate revenue, but also in a sustainable way. Help businesses grow. If you help businesses grow, you will be able to derive the revenue that you're looking for. I think that's been the challenge previously. We've been operating on a Pareto principle. Let's target 20, that gives us 80% of the revenue. And now we are learning that that cannot be sustainable. We've got to increase the base in order to get just a little, so that you don't kill the goose that lays the egg. You get from a wider base, you're able to promote businesses in that way, and revenue collection becomes a sustainable way. Businesses will be more productive, and the incentives will work in order to boost more revenues from a tax perspective as well.
Let me come to you, Robert. If you look at the performance of the various tax heads, pay was down, and down by almost edging on double digits. And for me, this is a point of concern, because the question is then, granted, I mean, the performance was as good as it was, but clearly there's an attrition as far as this fundamental base of revenue generation is concerned. Were you as bothered by it?
Certainly, when you talk about just under 10% decline in performance of the POIE tax head, there's reason to be concerned. And a lot has been said about the tax rates that Christine was talking about reducing for the first 9 months of last year. But certainly, when you think about the way forward, or when you look at the future for that tax head in particular, it tells you that there's been loss of jobs. So it's going to be very difficult to sustain that performance, for at least for POIE perspective, because people have lost jobs, people have had pay cuts and this kind of thing. Although I should say this is not unique to Kenya. I was just laughing with Christine here about Pakistan. Pakistan is the other revenue authority that has recorded a surplus.
Yeah.
So it's something that is happening across the world. But they have also recorded a decline in personal income tax. So that tells you that this is something that is not unique to Kenya. And so the question is, how do we support businesses to ensure that they get people back into employment? And like Christine is saying, expand that tax base so that even informal sector players are now contributing to the kitty.
All right, let's close this conversation in terms of the outturn for last year. Christine,
yes.
31 billion unlocked through some 552 cases, if I'm not wrong, through the Tax Appeals Tribunal. Were you impressed by this? I mean, clearly the TAT has been working on overdrive here.
Interesting question, Amboko. You see what has happened because of cash flow issues. The taxpayer has become very litigious. The Revenue Authority is also very litigious. So we had a lot of cases at the tax tribunal. We had a lot of cases going into the ADR. So what has happened is that because we've got to resolve issues. Tax matters can actually go for many years. Yeah. You've got to reduce that. The best way to do it is that the ADR has been a very good engine to unlock most of these cases. The tax tribunal had actually been overwhelmed by a lot of these matters, and revenues had been stuck there. So we are getting to a point whereby we are having proper conversations with the Revenue Authority, and we are saying, for this matter, let's see if we can come up with a consensus. If it is a matter of fact, let's see how we can be able to resolve it. Get it off the tribunal, take it to the through the ADR process, the alternative dispute resolution process. If you're able to come to a consensus, settle that dispute at that point in time, so that the issues that are really stuck at the tribunal are those issues that will help us as a country to build on the tax jurisprudence, so that even if it goes to the High Court, it's because we are trying to clarify issues of law, and that is very important because I can tell you there are quite a number of East African practices and other countries that look at Kenya as a source of tax matters. So yes, it gave us an opportunity to unlock quite a number of issues. Revenues were unlocked from that perspective, but most importantly, we are getting to a point whereby for the matters that are getting off the tribunal to the High Court are matters that are critical in building the tax jurisprudence of this country.
Right. Robert, you take?
No, certainly the Tax Appeals Tribunal has, I would say, benefited from the ADR perspective, and really congratulations to the Commissioner and her team for doing that, because remember, this is a process that was introduced roughly 2.5 years ago, and there was a lot of skepticism about its performance, but clearly unlocking 32 billion and 552 cases, that's an average of 1.75 cases per day. Yeah. So that tells you that these guys are really working. And for me, as a practitioner of tax, I think that's really the way to go, because what government needs is revenue. And so if businesses can work with the revenue administration to unlock these revenues, then that's very good for this country.
All right. Christine, there's been a lot of hue and cry online that, this performance has been registered at the expense of businesses, of individuals, because KRA has been perceived to be going hard, particularly on business ventures. Is this an assessment you would share, Christine?
That's interesting, Amboko. What happens is that it's not easy. You can imagine it's a very difficult year for taxpayers. Cash flow is king. If, for example, I'm to pay VAT, let me use a very basic example. The tax point for VAT is when you raise the invoice. In that instance, I'm supposed to account for the VAT and pay by the 20th of the subsequent month. But I haven't been paid because the person I supplied the goods or services to is ready to pay me three months after this. So I'm required to account for that tax now. it can be punitive. Businesses are hurting, for sure. It is not easy. The cost of compliance is not easy. However, that said, we really need to comply because that's the only way we can be able to raise that revenue. So I think what we just need to come up with tax laws or tax policies that will enable us have a sustainable way of raising that revenue so that you're not doing it at the expense of the taxpayers. Sometimes it may be painful, and I can tell you in this COVID year, it is not easy because there's no cash. And that's actually affecting, for example, the uptake of the tax amnesty. Taxpayers want to comply with the tax amnesty, but they're wondering, where am I getting that tax to pay? So, for example, the Revenue Authority has been very kind to give the taxpayers an opportunity to pay on installment basis. So what I'm saying is that, yes, it's a difficult year. Compliance can be very rough, but the negotiation and engagements with government is critical so that you're able to come up with ways in which you can settle that tax within a reasonable time.
Robert, very quickly before we take a break.
No, I think it's been a difficult year. There's no question about it. It's been a difficult year for businesses. The only hope that I have, and I think it's going to pan out positively, is that when you increase the taxpayers, the tax base, as we're talking about, I mean, you basically doubled it. So I expect that with a lot more people paying, it's going to be less painful because government then will be able to provide services to the common Mwananchi, which really is what we are targeting here.
Right, and that point by Robert Waruru takes us to a short break. When we come back, we'll be delving into the Finance Act of 2021. There's been so much complaints online and a lot of feedback. We shall be delving into that. Welcome back to Business Redefined, where we are looking at the taxation environment straight going into the Finance Act of 2021. Let me start with Christine. There now is a case which has been lodged in the High Court regarding 16% VAT on LPG, which of course comes in the context of the Finance Act of 2020, not even 21.
Yes.
Do you see us making any headway with this case?
Oh, I doubt we'll make any headway, Amboko, because that went through public participation, sadly, in 2020. And therefore, we had just been given like a reprieve for 1 year. So that has actually become law, and that's where you're feeling the impact of the 16% VAT on LPG. So let me say something different. What I've seen different this year, Amboko, even through the process of public participation. There's been a lot of engagement between taxpayers, between the with the National Treasury and with the Parliamentary Committee. The engagements that we've had this year with respect to the Finance Bill, Finance Act, or even sending proposals has been very, very helpful. So most of the issues that we are seeing that have come through the Finance Act, some of them which are good, some of them which are not very good, I must say, but have actually been sharpened by the fact that we had extremely good engagements with this, with the National Treasury. So once public participation happens, which is in compliance with the Constitution, actually it's provided for under Section 118 and 119 of the Constitution, it becomes very difficult to argue that the law just came in, it wasn't in the Finance Act before, it was actually there in 2020, and a reprieve of 1 year had been granted.
I see. Robert, on something slightly different here. The excise on loan processing fee. Many Kenyans are asking, how will this impact us in terms of the pricing of credit that we finally bear on this? Take it away.
Yeah, so you see, Julians, you'll have seen that most banks have already notified their customers that there'll be an additional 20% excess duty on loan processing fees, which is really sad because, like Christine says, in this economy, you're trying to get cash flow into the economy. So banks are trying to lend. So if I'm trying to get a loan of, say, 1 million shillings and the loan processing fee is 1%, on that 10,000 shillings, which is the 1%, I have to pay an additional 2,000 shillings in excess duty, which just makes credit, that much more difficult to access for the small businesses. And remember, these are the businesses that you want to create employment so that you can drive your POIE revenues, you can drive your corporate income tax, you can drive consumption so that you can drive VAT. So there's sort of like a policy disconnect there. However, having said that, I expect that there'll be a lot of controversy around this issue. And that is primarily because of the position taken by the Tax Appeals Tribunal with respect to other fees and, or returns rather, returns on loans. And the question is this processing fee a return on loan? And if it is, then it's still not subject to excess duty. Yeah. And that's I think, an issue that will have to be ironed out. Otherwise, we see a lot of disputes being precipitated by that provision.
Good point you're raising there. Christine, something very different here. Excise duty on imported eggs on imported onions. My first question is this: is it even in conformity with the common external tariffs of East Africa?
Interesting one. And Amboko, that's even a bigger problem. And it's the issue of the tax policy. As a country, we really need to come up with a tax policy so that you can be able to match the tax and the reason as to why that tax is being imposed. So I'll give an example. You've actually mentioned the one on excise duty on eggs. So what happens is that when you have, for example, a custom union like EAC, what is primarily controlled are import duty taxes. So what government sometimes does for purposes of revenue generation or for purposes of protecting the local industries, because they know they cannot touch on the import duty, they decide to use the excise tax route in order to increase the cost of that product. Now, the challenge is you need to understand, why are we really having this tax in the first place? We knew that excise taxes were mainly targeted at items that were considered seen items or luxuries. That's why you'd have excise tax on alcoholic drinks, on cigarettes, you know, on jewelry. Now, that makes a lot of sense. But when you see excise tax being introduced on furniture, imported furniture, on eggs, it kind of makes it very complicated to see where's our tax policy here. I know we've been promised it's coming. It had better come, because that will really infer, and it also makes it very easy for investors to predict the kind of taxes that will come. I mean, excise tax on spaghetti and eggs? How?
CS Ukuritani, if you're watching, remember you made a commitment to give us a tax policy, or rather to kickstart the process towards one, so we'll hold you on that word. Robert, still on excise, the issue on betting from 20% to 7.5%, but then widened the reach that it has. And of course, there are questions in terms of, fine, we understand betting, but what about the definitions of gaming, for instance? How do you go about that?
Yeah, you know, and before I answer that question, Julian, just to pick up on a point that Christine had said around excise. You see, I think government is using this as a policy tool to sort of protect the local economy. However, I think we run the real risk of being cited for flouting the protocol initiatives, or, you know, the intentions of the protocol, because effectively it means that farmers from Uganda will not be able to access the Kenyan market as far as eggs is concerned. I think what we should be doing is addressing our competitiveness and figuring out why is it that we are not competitive, why is it our products are not competitive. Otherwise, we are likely to see another case like what happened with you know, the bottles the other day in the East African Court of Justice, which has now been resolved. But to your point around excise, I think the idea there was, let's expand this tax base. Let's also be fair and not just target betting alone, because there are many games of chance. You know, there is prize money, there is gaming, which is in the casinos, there is betting. There is lottery, which you know, like charity sweepstakes and that kind of a thing. So the idea was, let's bring all these things together and let's tax them. Now the challenge is, that's a very good and a noble initiative. The challenge is that the Excise Duty Act does not define all these others. It only defines betting. So if you were to ask me what is gaming for excise duty purposes, I don't know. Yeah. I might know it for betting, Lotteries and Gaming Act, but I don't know it for tax purposes. And I think that is going to be a big issue with this. There's a gap there in my view as far as the implementation of that law is concerned.
Christine, I'm told we have about 5 minutes to go, but very quickly here. There's a gentleman on Twitter who is asking, are policies really the problem causing non-compliance, or there might be a problem to do with KRA's internal controls that create loopholes?
Oh, I think with the iTax system, Amboko, it becomes very difficult for there to be any opportunities for loopholes. I can give you a case in point. So for example, I'm a consultant. That's what I do for a living. I provide services to Robert and Company. Robert will withhold tax because he needs to comply from my services. That will be a trigger for the Revenue Authority, once that amount is put on my system, that Christine rendered this service, and the service has been already subjected to withholding tax, and we expect the remainder of 25% tax from Christine. So with the utilization of the iTax system, I can tell you, there's no opportunity for any loopholes within the system. Yeah. Compliance has been made extremely easy, but to the extent that it's bringing more taxpayers within the tax base. Previously, maybe Christine would have rendered that work from a briefcase. KRA would have never caught up with her, but now that's not an opportunity anymore.
All right.
Yeah.
Robert, what's the situation with excise duty on internet data subscriptions? A lot of discussion online about this.
Well, it's just become more expensive, 20% now,
Yeah.
from 15%. And, you know, it's very interesting because the government is going towards a digitalized economy, digital service delivery. You know, anything you want to do today, you want to renew your driving license, you want to apply for your passport, all these things are being done digitally. And so I think government has looked at that as a potential source of revenue and said, because anyway you need to access this, and this is where the economy is going, then we want to collect additional taxes from that. You know, it's sort of counterintuitive when you think about it, but that's where we are, 20%. It's quite expensive.
Let me see clarification here, because this one also confused me. When I was reading the Finance Act, remember we had this discussion about baby formula, will it be VAT exempt or not? So there was a tweaking in the Finance Act removed from the first schedule, but again, there was a wider scope introduced, I think, in the second schedule, if I'm not wrong. Christine, did you follow through this, and what did you make of it?
I know there was a lot of cleanup that went through the different schedules, that's the exempt schedule and the VATable schedule. So there was actually no specific change on the infat formula. It remained as being zero-rated and therefore not subjected to tax. You can imagine, Amboko, what's happening is that there's lots of finance acts every year.
Yes.
Yeah. And last year was even worse because we had a Tax Laws Amendment Act in April, a Tax Laws Amendment Act in December, and a Finance Act. So with those changes, it's possible for things to move even from a tariff coding perspective, but that's being cleaned up, and I believe that's an exercise that that it's been undertaken to ensure that there's consistency with the tariff codes and with the tax treatment for these items.
Robert, any addition on that?
No. At least we know that it should be covered under other infant formula or other infant milk. So at least that was good for the parliamentarians. And also just zero-rating flour, unga.
Sure.
You know, that really was a good one. I think that definitely will help ease the burden on Kenyans.
As we get to the tail end of this conversation, Robert, let me start with you. The position on syringes. What's the position? Because when you read the finance bill, a number of us had the impression that the target was to have them to be subject to VAT. Under the Finance Act, what's the position? So
it's now being cleaned up. They are exempt. Thankfully, they are now exempt. It's very clear now. So that was a cleanup.
I see. Clearly, there are some wins there. Let's wrap up. Question here, Christine. From a public participation standpoint, a lot of guys are now saying something like the LPG, a lot of cry online. What can citizens do from their side, from a public participation standpoint and SMEs?
That's a good question, Amboko, and I'm really I advocate a lot for public participation. And I can tell you, like, some of the wins that we managed to get with this Finance Act. Previously, digital service tax was taxable on both non-residents and residents. And it was very punitive on residents because residents already pay corporate tax, even though the digital service tax was an advanced tax. Yeah, but that has been removed. Now it's only targeted on non-residents who offer the services from an online on an online platform. So that was a good win when we look at it from a DST perspective. We also saw some very good wins from other issues. For example, on the investment deduction. So what I would like to encourage SMEs to do and other taxpayers is to come forth and take advantage of this process of public participation. I always say no one understands businesses best like taxpayers themselves. The Revenue Authority, government is trying to raise revenues. We understand our businesses best. So if there is a proposal in there that you feel does not work well for you, the impact on it is to actually decrease revenues, come forth. Argue your case. Some might go in, others, I know we had some other strong ones, Amboko, but they didn't see the light of day. But that it happens. But doesn't mean that the war is lost. We will continue in the process of public participation. And I hope that we can get to a position whereby we can be able to demonstrate to government that, you see, you gave us this concession. This is what we've managed to do. And actually either the tax base has increased or the different tax heads, if I do a cumulative of the taxes that we've collected, has actually gone up just because of you granting us that specific exception or exemption.
Robert, in less than a minute as we close, final point. To the defense of SMEs and many Kenyans out here, they will tell you the Kenyan tax code is just too complex. I've got many friends who, even just to read the Finance Act is a challenge for them. How can they be helped?
Well, number one, we're expecting the income tax bill, hopefully 2022, to come through, which is going to simplify. If I look at the 2019 bill, it brought down those sections to about 67 from 133 currently. So I think there's a move to simplify the tax regime, but suddenly engage, on social media, write emails to National Treasury, engage the Revenue Authority, and I think that's the way we are going to move this country forward.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we had for discussion tonight, focusing on taxation issues. Taxation issues always demand like 2 hours to be exhaustively covered. But we do appreciate your company and your feedback on this subject of the taxation environment, notably the outturn for FY 2021, as well as the Finance Act of 2021 and some of the salient issues underlying that. We shall continue with this coverage in our bulletins, in our stories, really just highlighting what the new Finance Act actually means for your pass as a business, as a household. So keep tuning to Business Redefined, and next week we shall be back with our continuing coverage of women in enterprise.